We are Women and Gender Studies Group 6, and this is our presentation on the century-long fight for birth control rights.
For the last century and a half, we have been debating and fighting over birth control rights in women's health care. All too often, it is seen as offensive or taboo. Worse still, birth control was often only a consideration when it affected men. With the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, we seem to be trying to go back in time, making it once again a taboo subject, and worse, a life and death issue for women. The Comstock Act of 1867 banned any material that was considered offensive. This included anything related to birth control or abortion. Despite this and being arrested a few times, in 1918, Margaret Sanger was able to convince the courts that contraceptives could be allowed if prescription-based. Her counterpart, Mary Dennett, disagreed and fought for them without prescription, but was turned down. The fear was women would get them without the consent of husbands or out of moral degradation. During World War I, as thousands of soldiers became incapacitated due to STDs, many of the world's armies sought to curb this issue by providing brothels that provided health care and birth control for the women, but only because they would be servicing the soldiers. The U.S., on the other hand, would not even allow condoms because of moral issues and was the only military to do so. Interestingly enough, the U.S. military suffered 7 million personal sick days due to STDs during World War I. After having one birth control clinic shut down for being immoral in 1916, Sanger reopened another disguised as a research center in 1923, which happened to offer birth control for married women. It would not be until 1942, when Planned Parenthood formed, that birth control would become acceptable and would not be actually practical until the introduction of the pill in 1960.
Continuing on the topic from 1918 to 2018, while this continued to be a debate in 2118, we will do a quick timeline from 1960 to 2006. 1960, the pill is introduced, but in more than 30 states, the Comstock Act is still in effect. 1965, U.S. Supreme Court rules contraception is allowed for married couples. In 1967, abortion is considered a felony in 49 states and D.C. In 1971, more than 100 years later, the Comstock Act is repealed. 1973, Roe v. Wade legalized abortion. And in 1976, Hyde Amendment bans use of federal aid for abortion. In 2006, emergency contraception approved for over-the-counter sale. Now, moving on to the image to your left, this image shows a woman, Annette Funicello, known as America's sweetheart of the 50s and 60s, being over-sexualized just because she's on the pill. One woman surrounded by men saying, "That's right, boys, I'm on the pill," which only fuels people with more conservative views. Their argument that birth control gives women the excuse to, quote, sleep around. So that's why we included that image. Also, it's perfect for the timeline that was provided previously.
That was then, and this is now. So in March 2010, the ACA made it mandatory for employers to provide insurance covering birth control. This, however, was contradicted in February 2012 when there was an introduction of an amendment that would allow any employer to deny insurance coverage for birth control based on a moral conviction. This infuriated a lot of people because it did contradict what the ACA had said in 2010. But luckily, in August of 2013, there was a release of new data that showed that giving women access to affordable birth control helped prevent 2.2 million unintended pregnancies in 2010, which would have resulted in 1.1 million unplanned births and 760,000 abortions if these pregnancies had actually happened without birth control.
In 2017, President Donald Trump signed a bill that cut funding for abortion providers. This nullified a rule that Barack Obama had passed in his last days in office that prevented state and local governments from withholding federal funding for family planning services, regardless of whether they also performed abortions. Some of these family planning services included contraception, sexually transmitted infections, fertility, pregnancy care, and breast and cervical cancer screening from qualified health providers. The signing was done in the Oval Office behind closed doors with no media present in a room full of only men in power signing something that greatly affects women. The new measure cleared Congress with Vice President Mike Pence casting the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. By targeting abortion, the Trump administration also targeted these important family planning services.
Abortion can be defined as the medical procedure of terminating a pregnancy within the first trimester. As an abortion is such a controversial topic, people are forced to choose a side, pro-choice or pro-life. Pro-choice means women have the basic human right to decide when and whether to have children, based on their own moral and religious beliefs, even though they themselves may not choose abortion as an option for an unplanned pregnancy. Before the Roe v. Wade case, abortions were declared a felony. The Comstock Law was passed in order to prohibit the distribution of birth control. However, in 1973, abortions were legalized and access to contraception was restored. Today, we can still see the fight between those who support pro-life and those who choose pro-choice.
So, the fight for birth control access started in 1916 when Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic. Now, birth control was banned at this time, so Sanger was thrown into jail and arrested, and eventually released, and this cycle continued of her being arrested and released until 1938, when, in collaboration with a federal judge, the ban off birth control was lifted. After this, there were many modern advances in birth control, such as in 1916, oral contraceptives hit the market. Then, soon after, in 1968, interuterine devices hit the market, which were a very appealing product to women because they were able to have something that they didn't have to remember to take every day and instead could just have for years on end and not have to worry about it. Then, in 1972, Baird v. Eidenstahl legalized birth control for all citizens, no matter race or ethnicity or socioeconomic status. Then finally, in 1990, contraceptive implants such as Nexplanon hit the market. These implants were wildly popular because of the complications that IUDs could cause as they were being implanted in the uterus. So these implants were being implanted in places like the arm that wouldn't cause these complications. But even though there were these great advancements in birth control, women still were faced with intense criticism for taking the birth control and found its accessibility to be limited, especially those of lower socioeconomic status. According to Power to Decide, out of 67 million women of reproductive age, 19 million live in contraceptive deserts. These contraceptive deserts are places where there is less than one clinic for every 1,000 women in need of contraceptives. Because of these deserts, private gynecology practices sometimes remain the only suitable place to obtain birth control, but expensive insurance copays makes this nearly impossible. This lack of accessibility to preventative birth control leads to large numbers of unintended pregnancies, which have increased by 3% in the last 7 years due to lack of accessibility. This increase of 3% has made unintended pregnancies over half of all pregnancies in the U.S. And 95 of these unintended pregnancies are due to a lack of affordable and accessible birth control. Besides being an important form of pregnancy prevention, birth control is also taken to prevent health issues such as acne, bone thinning, cysts, anemia, and even some cancers. Therefore, birth control is not only important to prevent unintended pregnancies, but for the overall health of women.
Is a type of permanent birth control, and just as any other form of birth control, there has always existed barriers that kept women from trying to be voluntarily sterilized. Before 1969, a large barrier existed in the form of the 120 rule. This rule stated that the product of your age and number of children you had needed to be over 120 in order to be voluntarily sterilized. This meant if a woman was 25 years old, she would have needed to have 5 children before she can get the procedure. By 1974, the 120 rule was scrapped and new regulations were in place. A person now had to be at least 21 years old and had to wait a 72-hour waiting period to go under the procedure. The final changes that still exist today came in 1979. The age requirement stayed the same, but now there is a 30-day waiting period after signing the consent form, which is shown to the right.
The consent form shown is the 2012 Texas version. Many issues can be seen from reading over the consent form once. First, the vocabulary. Study shows that the largest group of people getting sterilized are women in poverty who do not receive an adequate education. This means that they have difficulty in reading and understanding the form that consists of a very important decision in their lives. Second, the length of the form. As long as it may seem at a glance, only a fourth of the form is actually for the patient, while the remaining is left for others, mostly the doctor. This gives the idea that the decision is not really the patient's at all. Third, the consent form has an uncomfortable aura. When consenting, the statement seems to be almost shaming the patient for refusing to have children. Fourth, the waiting period. A patient must wait 30 days after signing to get the procedure, but they must also get the procedure before 180 days or the form expires and another one must be signed. Even in the case of an emergency, there must still be at least a 72 waiting period. And finally, the consent form must be signed and stored in a hospital or clinic where the procedure is to be done. These issues can be a matter of opinion, but either way, this consent form is still the largest reason women are getting denied the right to be voluntarily sterilized as a form of birth control.
The primary goal our group has devised is to ensure that the inherent right of holistic health for all people is being met by remedying the ways women are disproportionately obstructed from achieving this goal in the forms of restricted access to reproductive health care. However, because many possess differing opinions on how this goal would be applied, we have also come up with specific implementations. These implementations would be attached as demands or suggestions to a class action case. A class action case is a lawsuit in which a group of people with the same or similar injuries caused by the same product or action sue the defendant as a group. In this case, the injuries would encompass all the negative effects some women have faced due to being denied birth control practices or medications because the federal government does not adequately protect this human right. The plaintiff would then argue that better policies need to be implemented in order to prevent further injuries. The policies that we have come up with are as follows. Through a class action case, we demand that the Supreme Court votes to maintain the legality of abortion, oral contraceptives, and sterilization on a federal level, regulate state laws on reproductive health care to ensure that they do not restrict women's access, implement a plan to maintain status of clinics providing these services in areas where there's much social opposition, require insurance companies to include reproductive rights on their policies and include hospitals and practices that provide these services, make the public health of low-income communities a priority by funding free clinics and affordable practices in the area, and regulate the prices of necessary healthcare procedures and medications.
Solving the problem class action case. We plan on taking a class action case to the Supreme Court. We will argue the injuries created from unsafe birth control practices and access, including abortion, sterilization, and contraceptives. The woman with the most compelling case would be the representative plaintiff. Below are just a few of the injuries that would arise when advocating for contraceptives and safe legal abortions. Although the values of these claims may seem insignificant alone to the court, together the values would add up. Just a few of these include death of the mother, psychological damage, hemorrhaging, and injury to internal organs, as well as irregular periods, heavy blood flow, injury from the inability to carry a child, increased risk of ovarian and uterine cancer, and endometriosis.
So what can we do as Aggies? Some local methods we can use to fight this problem include creating Aggie youth groups, creating social movements, and establishing university-specific workshops. So youth groups include environments where people can share their education and disapproval of policies and can be found at both local and national levels. Young people's voices and concerns are important in drawing attention to a cause, and advocating for women's health would be a great way to go about this. Student-based youth groups have different goals, but they have one thing in common: a willingness to talk openly about their opposition to an issue and to raise awareness about its adverse effects on society. Whether it be the creation of a one-off educational event or a longer-term campaign. Aggies could definitely utilize this method to gain attention and combat the issue. Another method we could use is through social movements. So social movements, especially ones beginning on platforms such as Twitter and Facebook, can serve as powerful outlets for injustice and advocacy. If Texas A&M students want to push for better health rights for women across the U.S., social media can serve as a prominent platform to garner both attention and support. The strides we've seen through the Me Too movement and the Women's March support this idea greatly and show that there is potential to create better change for women in America. A final method we can use includes establishing university-specific workshops. The recent creation of the stand-up workshop at this school has successfully registered students to take part in a learning program designed to provide information about the issue of sexual assault and violence. The workshop itself teaches students about the issue at hand and instructs them on effective conversational tools and ways in which we can make a crucial difference and stand up against the issue. If we do the same thing by creating local workshops related to protecting female health and reproductive rights, we could truly begin taking some effective localized methods to help tackle the larger issue.